So the first thing you want to do when you get one of these machines is bolt some 2x4s on. These are heavy oak 2x4s I've bolted on so that you don't accidentally bump into it and tip it over. Now these machines can work in the vertical or horizontal position. They have pivot bolts and locking bolts here. So you can loosen these up and then you can tip the head down and have it in a horizontal, full vertical, or part way in between. These are not spring loaded, so there's no support. You have to support it yourself. They're fairly heavy, but they will go all the way down to the horizontal. And you can also operate it like this. You just have to make sure that you tighten these up properly. I've been using them about 30 years. I don't think I've ever really used it in the horizontal position. A lot of times I have it tipped back a few degrees just so it's easier to see what you're doing and that. But anyhow, if you're using it in a vertical position, it's always nice to have these bolted on the bottom. You really don't want this tipping over. Okay, so the adjustments on here are fairly straightforward. The feed unit, you have adjustable speed control here. This is an air cylinder, and these two cylinders are filled with oil. So the air supplies the power, the oil supplies the control. So you have pistons in all of these. As this thing pushes down, it forces the oil up through the valve here and back around the top, and you've got a compensating cylinder on the top here. So this is the speed control. It's a controlled feed down and a fast feed on the way back. They're very nice and smooth with the oil in. It's excellent. So you have the motor on the top here, and then the drive shaft underneath, which drives this oscillating head, which gives you the cut. This cut is adjustable. So on the chisels will be marked with the width of the chisel, the adjustable range, because you can adjust this to give you a longer stroke or a smaller stroke. So you have a certain range of adjustment, and then it'll give you the maximum depth that you should go. To adjust your position in reference to the table, you have an adjustment screw here and a locking lever on the casting here, which locks the motor in. So on here there's a graduated scale. It's 3 millimeters. One complete turn is 3 millimeters. It's graduated in millimeters and tenths of a millimeter. And then there's a reference mark on here. So you can adjust this quite accurately just by using this and without measuring anything if you wish. So you got each graduation is going to be about 4/1000ths of an inch. So pretty keen setup. Now I don't usually use that. Usually you'll find when you're working with any machine that there are several ways of doing every operation. Easy ways to work with this is just to cut a mortise and then use your digital calipers and measure your mortise size and spacing, its position, its length and its depth. So you can do all of that with these, and then you can then make your adjustments. You've got a stop fence here for the depth. If you need to go 3 millimeters deeper, then you just measure from the top of here and add or subtract 3 millimeters. It's quite accurate and easy to do. The first thing is to cut a mortise and then see where you are. So usually I just eyeball stuff. So if you want, you can scribe your mortise lines on here, put it up here, and you can move that in or out, whatever you want, and line it up with the marks till it looks good. Lock it back in. So that's how you adjust that. The table also travels up and down with a hand screw here on the bottom. The reason for the table adjustment is because you have different sized chisels and you need a certain gap between the top of your wood and the chisel, a ½ inch or more, for the chisel to get up to speed before it actually starts cutting into the wood. So the idea is, if you put a small chisel on there, you don't want to have 2 inches of gap before it hits your wood. You wind your table up so you've got about a ½ inch gap. Once again, saves you time. It's more efficient. You don't want to be cutting fresh air. So on top of the table you have reference stops. You also have a chip breaker, which I will show you goes on top here. We'll set that up in a minute. So for now, you reference your wood against these stops. I usually dress up a bunch of scraps of wood the same size as my finished stock, just so that I have pieces to test and everything in mortise and tenons. I do test cuts on scrap stuff first. The fence here is adjustable. You can change the angle on it and you can raise the fence up or down. So you can set the fence square if you want and just push it, put your wood in and loosen it and push it up. But I find quite often I just leave the fence set on an angle and I will put the piece of wood in. So I was using this piece. Put a piece of wood in and just tap a wedge in underneath. Wedge presses it up tight, gives it support, and usually I will cut a test mortise, leave it clamped in, and transfer the marks onto a piece of tape here, so I know exactly where my mortise is. Then I can cut off of reference lines. If I've marked all of my tenons and mortises out on the wood, I can just I put knife lines on, is what I use to mark. And I use knife lines on here, and I will then line it up with the knife lines and clamp it. So it's pretty seriously accurate to do without using the stops. But the stops come in handy if you've got a lot of pieces to do. You don't want to waste your time trying to fuss around and line the lines up. You just put the stop in and run all your boards up to the stop. Works good. And stops are also very useful when you're doing multiple passes. If you want to make the mortise wider than what this chisel is, you can set a spacer in behind it. Cut a mortise, take the spacer out, cut the second one, now you've got a wider mortise. So I'll show you that in a little while. So put a scrap of wood in, tap the wedge in so it's up tight, make sure that's locked. Connect your air line. Down here you have, in the electrical panel here, you have the main disconnect, on and off, power on, and this is the motor, forward, off and reverse switch. So once you've got the power on, you hit the button. Inside there is a low pressure safety switch, so if you don't have air pressure, nothing's going to come on. If you don't have enough air pressure, nothing's going to come on. Once you get the air pressure connected and it's up to the proper PSI, then you can operate the machine. That's just a safety feature, so you've got air pressure for the clamps and all. Anyhow, operating the machine is pretty simple. You set the depth stop on the back here. See how deep you're going to cut. You've set the distance on here. And the length you can adjust. Usually I set it in the middle. And then do a test cut. So the measurements, like I said, are on the chisel. And to adjust the length of your mortise a little bit either side of the center line. So this here has an arrow on it, and when you rotate this around, there's reference lines on the bottom on the piece that's turning and on the bottom of the oscillating unit. So when you wind them around till those line up, you will see that you have access to the screw here. And when you loosen that screw, you can then so when you loosen the screw, you can then turn this to make the slot longer. You turn it this way to make the slot smaller, shorter. And then you tighten this back up again. You have to make sure that's tight, good and tight. So you don't want it spinning around when it's not clamped. This is a clamp and clamps on the oscillating unit onto the cylinder, so you need to clamp it up good and solid. So once that's done, you're ready to roll. You hit the start switch. You don't need to go all the way down. This is why I have the clamp set up like this with a stop on it, so it keeps the wood clamped in. And then I can then transfer where the mortise is, the actual size of the mortise. I transfer it straight over to here. Now you have two knife lines exactly where your mortise is. What you can do if you want, you can use, it doesn't matter what tape you use. I've got a bit of silver tape. You can use it even if you want, pull off the pieces, cut through the tape and pull them off, and then you'll just have a piece of tape exactly where your mortise is. Makes it easier to see. But for now I'm just going to leave those on there. So that's one way of marking your mortise position. Another way is just to put a block on there and wind this. See, it'll push that, and then you can scribe a line marked off of there, and you do the same on this way. You just wind it round, it'll push the block over. So it's fairly easy to get a very accurate position for there. If you do the mortise full depth, you've got your position marked here. And then you can check the position of your space in here. So you can adjust it incrementally up here. You can also check the depth of your mortise, and then if you want, you can adjust this stop rod here. If you need to go a bit deeper or not quite that deep, you can just adjust that. So it's quite easy to set the depth the spacing and the length. And like I said, if you want to make your mortise a little longer, you just loosen this and turn this around a little. So it's nice to have the flexibility of having that little bit of a range in there. Now, if you wanted to make your mortise bigger, wider than your chisel, you can work with spacers. So if you want a 16th, this is a piece of 16th, this is a piece of 16th balsa. You can get balsa wood in 16th, 8ths, so 3/16 and 1/4 inch spacers, so it works out quite handy. So if you want to work like this way to make your mortise wider, you're better off to use the stop. I seem to be rubbing up against this clamp. Let's get that out of the way. So if you set it up against the stop, and then so now you've made your mortise wider simply by putting a spacer in. So it's pretty easy. You can put different size spacers in, and as long as you've got a stop there to reference it against, you can adjust your mortise size without even changing the chisel, which is kind of nice. You can also put stops to make it longer if you want. If you want to make the mortise longer, you can put a stop in there. So it's pretty easy to use some kind of a spacer. You want your 1/4 inch longer, you can put a spacer in here, or you can put a spacer in here. And then you cut the mortise. Make one pass and take the spacer out, put it in, it'll cut your mortise, excuse me, a 1/4 inch longer. So I use a lot of times, I use pieces like this. This is tool steel, you get 1/4, 3/8, 1/2 inch, so you got, it's pretty easy if you want to set up adjustments like that. Where were we? I was going to set up, okay, so that's where that is. If you want to set a chip breaker, which will stop this little bit of fuzzing on the outside there. Once you've done your test cut, you leave the piece of wood clamped in, and then you put your chip brake on. You tighten your chip breaker up, and you run the chip breaker right up to the edge of the cut. And that protects right at the edge of your cut, so you don't even get any of this little feather edge there. I don't know if you can see that. See, the blade even cuts a piece of wood, and that's quite all right. So that gives you a super clean edge. So that's pretty much it for setting it up and using it. It's not that difficult. You find a bunch of different ways of working with it. After you've worked with it and used it, you find out which way works best for you. And there are different ways of doing it for different jobs you're working on. But basically, this is a super slick machine for doing the traditional style mortises, for if you're doing furniture, whether it's Japanese style furniture, woodworking, or arts and crafts stuff, musical instruments, or window sash. If you're doing traditional wooden window sash, these are the machines. You can do doors with them. You can't do really big mortises in one pass. You can do it in 2 or 3 passes, is no problem. Like I said, you can set up stops. A lot of people use them for cabinet doors, interior doors. You can do the occasional exterior door with them, no problem at all. You might, like I said, if you want to do an extra long mortise, you might want to do it in 2 or 3 passes, that's all. But they're absolutely brilliant machines. It's a sin they're not making them anymore. This one I have for sale on my website right now, SolidwoodMachinery.com, if anyone's interested. Anyhow, really appreciate your time. Thanks a lot, and we'll come back with another video when I got another machine finished, I hope. Okay, thank you.